morning, good afternoon, good evening. Man is a creature of reason. And when you try to rationalize why some countries have prospered while others have not, or why even the same nation at one point in their history they seem to be doing very well, and then at another point they're not doing so well. The bottom line will be that when man is using his brain power or embraces the importance of the brain power, you will prosper. And when you try to suppress it, you will regress. Zimbabwe is a failed state because we have failed to embrace man's ability to think and therefore taken full advantage of the human contribution to the society's economic prosperity, peace, and justice. I'll just let Professor Brain Cox explain a bit about the human brain, why man has become the dominant animal, dominating all other living things.
Beginning with our early ancestors who settled in the newly formed rift.
3 million years ago, the hominin species that could be found in East Africa was Australopithecus. It's kind of a grim-looking chap. Now, this is really not much more than a chimpanzee that stands upright, certainly in brain capacity. Its brain volume is around 400 cc's. But then, 1.8 million years ago, something spectacular happens. You get an explosion of hominin species, including this, Homo erectus, with a brain size that is double Australopithecus. Then, 800,000 years ago, this species appears, Homo heidelbergensis, accompanied by another rapid increase in brain size from 800 cc's to around 1200 cc's. Then, we wind forward to 200,000 years ago, this skull, called Homo 2, a brain size of around 1400, 1500 cc, which is close to my brain size. So this is one of the first skulls that you can say is a modern human.
Interesting.
I'll just stop it there for a minute and fast forward it to the bit where he explains the brain power. Bear with me.
This is it, the human brain. And it might not look like it, but it's the most complex physical structure we know of anywhere in the universe. There are over 80 billion neurons in the average human brain. That's comparable to the number of stars in a galaxy. That doesn't even begin to describe its complexity. Those neurons form connections between 10,000 and 100,000 connections to other neurons. And it's from that complex circuitry that the human condition emerges. Everything that makes us who we are comes from this 1.5 kilograms of matter that resides in the skull of every human that has ever walked the earth. So, who are we? Well, a possible answer is that we are something that emerges from electrical activity inside this impossibly complex blob of matter.
And mankind, all modern human beings, share the same brain with the same capacity. And yet, it must be said, within each society, you have found that some have made progress while others have not done so. And even within a society, at one point, they seem to be making progress, at another, going backwards. This is a characteristic that can be observed throughout human history. And the one thing you can always pick out is that the times when human beings are making strides, progress, is only when that society appreciates the capacity of the human brain, embraces it, and takes advantage of it for the good of the society. Those who have failed to embrace it have paid dearly for it. Here is one country, Singapore. Singapore, in 1965, when the country broke away from Malaysia, was nothing more than just a spit of land at the bottom of the Malay Peninsula. It had the same problems of mass unemployment and poverty. It was no more than just a village, a fishing village. But Malaysia, Singapore today has grown from a third world country in 1965 to a first world country by the turn of the century. Its secret? Well, I'll let Tony Blair explain what happened with Singapore.
The fascinating thing about Lee Kuan Yew is he took 3 important decisions right at the beginning for Singapore. Each one of them now seems obvious. Each one at the time was deeply contested. Number 1, he said, everyone's going to speak English in Singapore. Now, there were lots of people who said to him at the time, no, we need to have our own local language. We need to be true to our roots and everything. He said, no, English is the language of the world and we're all going to speak English. Secondly, he said, we're going to get the best intellectual capital from wherever it exists in the world and we're going to bring it to Singapore. And again, people said, no, we should stand on our own 2 feet. And you're also bringing in the British, who we just, who we've got all these disputes with. And he said, no, I'm going to bring in the best from wherever they are, and they're going to come to Singapore. And the third thing he did was he said there's going to be no corruption. And one of the ways we're going to do that is we're going to make sure our political leaders are well paid, which the Singapore leaders are the best paid in the world. And there's going to be zero tolerance of corruption. Those are the 3 decisions that were instrumental in building Singapore today.
I would like to rephrase that argument. What Singapore did was acknowledge the importance of quality. The best brains will pay them well to help Singapore develop. They paid people for their contribution, for their merit, purely on merit. Wherever they come from, if you are the best person, we will get you, and we are willing to pay for it. they appreciated quality. When Zimbabwe gained its independence in 1980, we had some of the best economic infrastructures in Africa. Our economy, regardless of the civil war that had been raging in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, was a robust economy. And I don't have to tell you that Zimbabwe has vast natural resources. Our land is one of the best. Zimbabwe boasted of being the breadbasket of the region. We competed with even big countries like the US in producing cash crops like tobacco. We produce some of the quality, best tobacco in the world. That was 1980. But the economy started its decline soon after independence. And it was to take a nosedive in the period 2000 to 2008. That was marked by Mugabe seizing all the white-owned farms and giving them to mostly ZANU-PF cronies. And Zimbabwe's economic agriculture collapsed. And ever since, more often than not, we've had to rely on imported food. In some cases, we couldn't even pay for it. So we've had to rely on food aid. A country that used to be the breadbasket of the region is now relying on handouts, food aid. The period 2000 to 2008 was also marked by the voodoo economics of printing money. Zimbabwe is now a world record holder. We printed one of the highest currency note denominators, 1,000 trillion dollar note, which at the time when the dollar was finally scrapped in 2008, November 2008, was probably worth 1 US cent. That's how far we'd gone. A Japanese scholar and writer, Ken Yamamoto, who had traveled and studied Zimbabwe in the early 80s, and predicted that Zimbabwe had the potential to become the South Korea of Africa in terms of economic development. And yet, within a very short few decades, we had fallen from being an upper middle income country to one of the poorest in the world. How did we get there? Dr. Simbama Koni, in an interview, explained how we got there.
I recall very clearly that when we came into office in 1980, we inherited Ian Smith's systems. And Ian Smith's ministers drove Peugeot 504s. They drove themselves from home to work in their Land Rovers and all in kinds. Most of them were farmers. They parked their Land Rover and then they used the government vehicle when they were at work with a chauffeur. When they finished at night, they packed them and they took theirs to go home. Within the month of our coming into office, Prime Minister Mugabe then directed that every minister be issued with an E-class Mercedes-Benz. And the Peugeot 504s were retired to permanent secretaries, and the deputy ministers who then took over. We can also look at many other things, small they may appear at the time. Let me hazard that even at that point, Enos Nkala was our Minister of Finance. I don't think we knew what budget we inherited from Ian Smith when the decision was taken to buy those E-class fleets for the ministers. So the material affection for material things has always been with us. And the differentiation also, even going back into the camps, Zemashefu, my comrades Makada were not the same. So much so that...
Well, we can go on that one. But the most important point there to note is that soon after independence, Mugabe, as the leader, like the Singapore leader, he decided to pay those around him very well. But instead of paying them as a reward for their intellectual contribution, Mugabe was paying them for their silence. Mugabe's cabinet is one of the most useless, if one can put it that way, one can imagine. The ministers, deputy ministers, MPs, and so forth were so compliant to the point where Margaret Donko at one point described them as Vakadzi wa Mugabe, in sheer contempt and frustration at how they always groveled to Mugabe. They never challenged him, even on a matter that will say, this cannot be allowed to go on. Notably, the 1983 to 1987 Kukurawundi. And yet not one minister raised their voice. Why? They had all been issued, as Simbama Konide explained, the E-class Mercedes-Benz and all these other generous salaries and trappings of high office. It was, of course, for the simple purpose of bribing them so that they did not challenge Mugabe. Where the Singapore leader was promoting and was willing to seek quality wherever it was available and reward it accordingly, Mugabe, if there was quality at all, around those who were around him, he bribed them to buy their silence. There is no doubt that some of the ministers, like the guy who became Minister of Finance soon after Enos Nkala, that Simbamakon was talking about there, Dr. Bernard Chizero, I think he was an economist of quality, and yet even he found himself being used more for window dressing than for his contribution. As for the others, the likes of the guy who became vice president, Simon Muzenda, and another one, Emerson Mnangagwa, Joyce Mujuru, those individuals, I think no one can, in all honesty, say they had any brain. These were just buffoons who were promoted to high position for the purposes of groveling to Mugabe. They would never dare challenge him on anything. Not that they had the brains to do it. But why would somebody promote brain dead individuals when you could promote people with some brain? Simple. Mugabe didn't want the competition. He wanted to be the star. And one of the reasons why he would not give up power, he stayed in power for 34 years until he was finally deported out in the military coup of 2017. For 37 years, rather, sorry. His argument was, there is nobody to replace me. Of course, he had taken care of that. He surrounded himself with the likes of Mnangagwa. No one could really say they were hot on letting the likes of Mnangagwa take over. He has since taken over, but he has also learned, as we can see in the picture there, that as long as he's able to bribe those around him, they will do as he please. In this cartoon, he was bribing opposition MPs and his own SANU-PF MPs. He gave them in November 2022 US 40,000 housing loan, he called it. A lot of those MPs were to lose their job within 6 months because the country was heading for elections. They were not going to repay that 40,000. Everybody knew that. They knew it was a bribe. But this was to side by their silence, because what was to follow was more and more bribes. Mnangagwa went on to bribe the chiefs with cars. Even ordinary Povo, he must have spent hundreds of millions of dollars in passing them from one rally to another and feeding them with this chicken and chips. Where was that money coming from? And those higher up got even more generous bribes. All the judges of the country were all to receive US $400,000 just a few weeks before nomination courts were to start. Of course, the judiciary were to play a key role throughout the election process, particularly during the campaigning period and the elections. And so Mnangagwa had to make sure that they are well paid and their silence guaranteed. So here we are. We are spending a lot of money to suppress quality. We don't want people who think. We prefer those who do not think. Is it any wonder then that the country is repressed? The road I was showing earlier on there was one of the A roads before independence. This is the sorry state of some of our A roads in Zimbabwe today. After decades of gross mismanagement and rampant corruption, of course, we have regressed. I think one of the disappointing things about Zimbabwe is that we bury our heads in the sand and would not even acknowledge that we have regressed. One of the things that, if you want to end the anger of the SANU-PF diehards, is to say that the country is repressed. Mnangagwa maintains that the country is on course to achieving our upper middle income status we started with in 1980 by 2030. He calls it Vision 2030. It's a nonsense, of course. How can we say we are going to achieve the upper middle income status when our roads are in this state? This is the A road, one of the A roads in Zimbabwe. Mnangagwa has been in power now for 7 years. And this is the state of the A roads. One does not have to imagine the sorry state of the other minor roads in the country. Even in the urban centers, there are potholes everywhere. Are we going to be an upper middle income nation whose A roads are in this state? After 7 years of this so-called Second Republic, there's not been any progress at all. Why we should continue to pretend that we are on course beggars belief. It's like somebody walking on a farm halfway through the growing season. You can see that the maize in the field are no more than just a few feet high. This is at the time when they should be flowering. The quality of the plants themselves speaks volumes. And then when you look at a field like that, you can in all honesty, say there's not going to be a bumper harvest here. You do not have to wait for the end of the season to acknowledge that. We do not have to wait for 2030 to acknowledge that Zimbabwe is a failed state. This is what is so disappointing about Zimbabwe. We don't even want to acknowledge when we've gone wrong. Zimbabwe, one of the reasons why Zimbabwe is a failed state is that we failed to hold free, fair, and credible elections for 44 years. The last 24 of which was with the connivance of SANU-PF, of the opposition, MDC. Why Zimbabweans are refusing to accept that Nelson Chamisa lied when he said to the people of Zimbabwe last year he had plugged all the vote-rigging loopholes, just to con them to participate in a flawed election process to give ZANU-PF legitimacy. Beggars belief. Why are you denying it? But that is part of the process, the mental process, the failure to accept the reality. I'll just end this with a video clip of Nelson Chamisa cornered by the BBC ad hoc reporter on that very point. Lying.
Ende patakasangana na Trump akatibvunza naye Apeman, mari yamuri kuda kuti nyika ifambe imari.
Serious questions were raised about your behaviour in Washington, D.C. You did see some senior people on Capitol Hill, some Congress people, but you also claimed that you'd seen Donald Trump. You claimed you had a conversation with him in which you said he asked you how much you needed to move the country forward. You told him $15 billion, and he said to you that he would provide the money if you won the election. That was not true, was it?
Sangana na Trump akatibvunza naye Apeman, mari yamuri kuda kuti nyika ifambe imari.
It was not true that you'd seen Donald Trump and that Donald Trump indicated to you that he would provide, if you won the election, $15 billion.
All those statements were said by other people, not what I said.
Kasangana na Trump akatibvunza naye Apeman, mari yamuri kuda kuti nyika ifambe imari.
Well, no, because there is a video which shows you at a rally in January back home in Zimbabwe saying that Donald Trump had pretty much promised you $15 billion. To be clear, because some people in Zimbabwe are still confused, you're now telling me you did not meet Donald Trump.
We did not.
So I finish with what I started saying at the beginning. Zimbabwe is a failed state. I think it's because we have failed to appreciate the importance of the brain power. We have not freed ourselves to think objectively, to acknowledge where we have failed. Our fear of being wrong has imprisoned us. Zimbabwe is going to go into the 2028 elections with not even one token democratic reform implemented. Already we have had 44 years of rigged elections. How it is that in this day and age, we can fail to hold free, fair, and credible elections. It's unbelievable. And yet, that's where we are. We fail to appreciate what constitutes free, fair, and credible elections in this day and age. I think it's because we are not using our head. We are not using our brain. We want to pretend that what everybody else can see is not there. Who are we deceiving? I think the most shameful thing that can happen in 2028 is that ZANU-PF will rig the elections. CCC or Chamisa, whatever new party he launches, he will tell his followers that he has got ways of stopping ZANU-PF rigging the elections and thus con them to participate in those flawed elections again, knowing fully well that by participating you give ZANU-PF legitimacy. And if we participate in our millions, I can rest assure you that SADC will find it very difficult to deny this ZANU-PF political legitimacy. And as we can see with all the hoo-ha happening with the opposition right now, Chamisa and company will complain to SADC and ask them that they should take action. And yet we are the ones who landed ourselves into this mess. As far as I know, the Zimbabweans' brain power, the size of the brain is no different from the size of the brain you'll find in any other human being in the world over. The only difference is that as a nation, we have not embraced the importance of this vital organ. We have not allowed ourselves to think, to learn from the past, and to learn from history, and to embrace the importance of brain power. It's a crying shame. Thank you very much, and have a nice day.